Unaware of her $20 million legacy, greedy son tried to brand his own mother senile to seize it. "You're losing your mind, mother." The words hit Margaret Whitmore like ice water, each syllable sharp enough to cut through the humid afternoon air hanging heavy in her kitchen. Her son Conrad stood in the doorway, his expensive suit wrinkled from the summer heat, his face twisted into something she barely recognized. Behind him, his fiancée Charlotte shifted uncomfortably, her manicured fingers clutching a velvet jewelry box that made Margaret's stomach lurch. The box. Thomas's box. The one that had held his wedding ring for 43 years. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the granite countertop, her knuckles white against the cool stone. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Thomas's morning coffee, the French roast he'd brewed religiously every day until the heart attack stole him from her 6 months ago. The scent now felt like a ghost haunting her grief. "Conrad," she whispered, her throat tight. "That ring, it was your father's. It was all I had left of." "Had," he interrupted, his voice cold as winter steel. "Past tense, mother. We needed the money for the wedding. You weren't using it anyway, just letting it collect dust in a drawer while you sit here talking to shadows." The cruelty in his tone made her chest ache, but it was Charlotte's barely concealed smirk that sent fury racing through Margaret's veins. This woman, barely 30, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, stood in the home where Margaret had raised Conrad with love and sacrifice, acting as though she owned the place. "You sold it," Margaret said, not as a question but as a statement of devastating fact. "You sold your father's wedding ring." Conrad shrugged, the gesture casual and dismissive. "It was just sitting there. Dad's been gone for 6 months. You need to accept that and move on instead of clinging to the past like some senile old woman." The word senile hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack, not just from grief now, but from the recognition that the little boy she'd once rocked to sleep, the child she'd taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework, had grown into someone capable of this level of betrayal. But before we dive deeper into Margaret's story, let me pause and say hello to all of you beautiful souls watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, whether you're sipping your morning coffee, taking a break from work, or winding down for the evening. I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. These stories take so much heart to create, and your support means everything to our growing family here. Now back to Margaret, standing in her kitchen, facing the unthinkable. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains Thomas had always teased her about, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floor he'd installed himself the year they bought the house. Every corner of this room held memories. Conrad's first steps right there by the refrigerator, birthday cakes cooled on this very counter, quiet conversations over coffee while Conrad slept upstairs, safe and loved. Now that same kitchen felt like a battleground. Margaret's eyes fell on the empty space on the windowsill where Thomas's ring box had always sat, catching the morning light. For 43 years, that diamond had represented every promise they'd kept, every storm they'd weathered together. Thomas had worked double shifts at the factory to buy that ring, coming home with blistered hands and an exhausted smile, saving every penny for 6 months. "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That ring was more than jewelry. It was the past," Charlotte interrupted, her voice sharp with impatience. "Conrad and I are building a future. The wedding venue alone costs $15,000, and we're not about to scale back our dreams because you're too sentimental to see reason." Margaret stared at this woman who would soon share her family name, this stranger who spoke about dreams as though they were more important than memory, more valuable than love. The engagement ring on Charlotte's finger caught the light, a massive stone that probably cost more than Thomas had made in a year. "Where?" Margaret asked quietly. "Where did you sell it?" Conrad exchanged a glance with Charlotte, and Margaret caught something in his expression, guilt, maybe, or calculation. "What does it matter? It's done. I want to know where my husband's ring is." "Klein's Jewelry on 5th Street, Charlotte said quickly, as though ripping off a bandage. "We got a fair price. More than fair, actually." Margaret's breath caught. Klein's. She knew that shop, had walked past it countless times over the years. The idea of Thomas's ring sitting in a stranger's display case, waiting for someone else to claim it, made her feel physically ill. Conrad stepped closer, and Margaret caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, desperation, maybe, or the sharp tang of sweat despite his composed exterior. "Mother, you need to understand something," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a gentle tone. "You haven't been yourself since Dad died. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned you've been forgetting things, repeating yourself. Just yesterday, you asked me twice if I'd heard from my college roommate, and he graduated 15 years ago." The lie hit her like a physical blow. She had never asked about his college roommate. She remembered everything, perhaps too clearly. Every slight, every dismissal, every time he'd looked at her with barely concealed impatience since the funeral. "That's not true," she said firmly. "I never." "See." Conrad turned to Charlotte with an expression of patient suffering. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. She doesn't remember having conversations, gets confused about dates. The grief has obviously affected her more than she wants to admit." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, not from confusion, but from the dawning realization of what was happening. Conrad wasn't just dismissing her pain. He was rewriting reality, creating a narrative where she was the unreliable narrator of her own life. "I'm not confused," she said, but even to her own ears, her voice sounded small, uncertain. Charlotte placed a manicured hand on Conrad's arm, a gesture that looked supportive, but felt like a performance. "Maybe we should talk to Dr. Reynolds about getting her evaluated. Just to be safe." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that made Margaret's pulse quicken. Evaluated. The suggestion hung in the air with all the weight of threat and consequence. Conrad nodded slowly, as though the idea had just occurred to him. "That's not a bad idea. Someone objective could help us figure out the best way to take care of you." Take care of her. The phrase should have sounded loving, protective. Instead, it felt like a cage closing around her freedom. Margaret looked from her son to his fiancée, these two people who had invaded her kitchen, sold her most precious possession, and were now discussing her future as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the floor, and the house felt colder despite the summer heat. She thought of Thomas, of the way he would have handled this moment. He'd been quiet but strong, a man who chose his battles carefully, but never backed down when something truly mattered. What would he do if he could see their son now, standing in their kitchen, selling pieces of their life to fund his own? "Get out," Margaret said quietly. Conrad blinked. "What?" "I said get out of my house." Her voice was stronger now, carrying the authority of someone who had scrubbed these floors, painted these walls, and earned every inch of this space through decades of love and labor. Charlotte's perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're only trying to help." "Help!" Margaret's voice rose, surprising herself with its strength. "You sold my husband's wedding ring to pay for your party, then stood in my kitchen calling me senile. That's not help. That's cruelty." Conrad's expression shifted, hardening into something colder. "Fine. But this conversation isn't over, Mother. We're going to have to address your situation sooner or later." As they turned to leave, Charlotte paused at the doorway, looking back with eyes that held no warmth, only calculation. "We really do want what's best for you, Mrs. Whitmore. I hope you'll remember that." The front door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded more final than a slam would have. Margaret stood alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of better days, the ring box gone, and the terrible knowledge that the son she'd raised with infinite love had become someone she no longer recognized. Outside, a neighbor's lawn mower started up, the sound of normal life continuing while hers felt like it was unraveling thread by thread. She walked to the sink and gripped the edge, staring out at the garden Thomas had planted, the roses he'd tended every summer until his hands grew too weak. The phone rang, sharp and unexpected in the quiet house. Margaret's heart jumped. Maybe it was Conrad calling to apologize, to say he'd come to his senses. Maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could still be fixed. She lifted the receiver with trembling fingers. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore? This is Robert Klein from Klein's Jewelry. I have something that I believe belongs to you." The jeweler's voice on the phone carried a weight that made Margaret's knees weak. She sank into Thomas's recliner, the worn leather still holding the impression of his body, still smelling faintly of the old spice aftershave he'd worn for 30 years. "What do you mean?" she whispered into the receiver, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her heart. "Ma'am, I'd rather discuss this in person. Could you come to the shop tomorrow morning? Say around 10. Margaret's fingers traced the arm of the chair where Thomas used to rest his hand while reading the evening paper. The fabric was threadbare there, worn smooth by decades of the same gentle gesture. Is it about the ring?" There was a pause, then a careful sigh. "Among other things, yes. Your husband was a thoughtful man, Mrs. Whitmore. More thoughtful than most people realized." After she hung up, Margaret sat in the growing darkness of her living room, too drained to reach for the lamp switch. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, the language of old wood and older memories. Every sound reminded her of evenings spent here with Thomas, him reading while she mended clothes or worked on her needlepoint, Conrad doing homework at the kitchen table, their life unfolding in comfortable, predictable rhythms. She had been Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell then, 22 years old, and working as a secretary at the insurance office downtown. Thomas had been the quiet claims adjuster who brought her coffee every morning and never seemed to know what to do with his hands when he talked to her. Their courtship had been gentle, unhurried. Sunday drives through the countryside, picnics by the lake, long conversations about books and dreams and the kind of life they wanted to build together. Thomas had proposed on a Tuesday evening in this very room, dropping to one knee beside the fireplace while she sat on the sofa, a half-finished scarf in her lap. His hands shook as he opened the ring box, revealing the modest diamond that had taken him 8 months to save for. "I know it's not much," he'd said, his voice barely steady. "But it's real, and it's forever, just like my promise to you." She'd cried then, not because the ring was small, but because of the way he looked at her, as though she were the most precious thing in his world. They'd married 6 months later in the little church on Elm Street, surrounded by family and friends who understood that what they were witnessing wasn't just a wedding, but the beginning of something rare and enduring. Conrad had come along 3 years later, after 2 heartbreaking miscarriages that had left Margaret hollow and aching. When she finally held her son in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb, she'd felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. Thomas had cried harder than she did, this gentle man who'd waited patiently through the dark months, who'd held her while she grieved the children they'd lost. They'd built their life around Conrad, every decision filtered through what was best for him. Thomas worked overtime at the insurance company, eventually becoming a senior adjuster, while Margaret managed their home with the precision of a military operation. Conrad's childhood had been safe, comfortable, predictable. Little league games and piano lessons, birthday parties and family vacations to modest lake cabins where they'd fish and play board games and talk about everything and nothing. When had it changed? Margaret tried to pinpoint the moment when her loving, grateful son had transformed into the cold stranger who'd stood in her kitchen that afternoon. Was it college, when he'd met friends whose families had more money, bigger houses, fancier cars? Was it his first job at the marketing firm, where image seemed to matter more than substance? Or was it gradual, so slow she hadn't noticed until it was too late? She thought about Charlotte, with her designer clothes and calculated smile. Conrad had brought her home for dinner 8 months ago, just 2 months before Thomas's death. Margaret had tried so hard to like her, to see what her son saw in this woman who spoke in perfectly constructed sentences and never quite seemed present in any conversation. Charlotte had complimented the house with the kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed, asking questions about the neighborhood's investment potential and whether they'd ever considered updating the decor. Thomas had been polite but quiet that evening, his journalist's instincts picking up something Margaret had missed. Later, as they'd cleaned dishes together, he'd said carefully, "She's not what I expected for Conrad." "What do you mean?" Margaret had asked, though she'd felt the same unease. "She looks at things differently than we do, like she's calculating value instead of seeing worth." Now, sitting in the darkness, Margaret wondered if Thomas had seen something she'd refused to acknowledge. Had he noticed the way Charlotte's eyes swept their home, cataloging possessions and possibilities? Had he caught the subtle disdain in her voice when she spoke about older couples and their quaint attachment to outdated things? The phone rang again, jolting Margaret from her memories. She fumbled for the receiver, hoping against hope that it might be Conrad, calling to apologize. "Margaret? It's Ruth Caldwell from next door." Margaret's stomach clenched. Mrs. Caldwell had been her closest neighbor for 15 years, the kind of woman who brought casseroles during illness and borrowed cups of sugar with genuine gratitude. But her voice tonight carried a careful distance that made Margaret's skin prickle with dread. "Ruth, hello." Margaret tried to keep her voice steady. "I hope you don't mind me calling, dear. I ran into Conrad at the grocery store this afternoon, and he mentioned you've been having some memory issues lately. I wanted you to know that if you need anything at all, Bill and I are right here." The words landed like physical blows. Memory issues. Conrad had been talking about her to the neighbors, spreading his poison beyond the walls of her own home. "I'm fine, Ruth," Margaret managed. "There's nothing wrong with my memory." "Of course, dear. Of course. It's just that grief can affect us in so many ways, and sometimes we don't realize." Ruth's voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between them like smoke. After the call ended, Margaret sat in Thomas's chair and felt the walls of her world closing in. Conrad wasn't just stealing from her. He was methodically destroying her reputation, her relationships, her very sense of self. How many neighbors had he spoken to? How many friends would start looking at her with that careful, pitying expression she'd heard in Ruth's voice? She thought about Dr. Reynolds, their family physician for over 20 years. Would Conrad call him next, suggesting that his mother needed evaluation? Would he twist innocent conversations, normal moments of grief and adjustment, into evidence of declining mental capacity? Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the lamp switch. Light flooded the room, illuminating the photographs on the mantelpiece. Her wedding day, Conrad's graduation, family Christmas mornings, Thomas's retirement party. In every picture, they looked like what they'd been, a family bound by love and genuine affection. When had it become a lie? She stood and walked to the kitchen, needing to move, to do something with the energy coursing through her veins. On the counter sat the mail she'd collected that afternoon, bills, advertisements, a sympathy card from her sister in Portland. Nothing urgent, nothing that suggested a woman losing her grip on reality. Margaret opened each bill methodically, checking the amounts against her records, balancing figures with the same careful attention she'd maintained for 43 years of managing their household finances. Every number matched. Every detail was correct. Whatever Conrad was telling people about her memory, it wasn't based in truth. She thought about the ring again, about Thomas's hands as he'd slipped it onto her finger all those years ago. Those hands had held hers through childbirth and child loss, through his father's funeral and her mother's long illness, through every ordinary Tuesday and extraordinary milestone of their shared life. The ring had been more than jewelry. It had been a symbol of promises kept, of faithfulness honored even when it was difficult. And Conrad had sold it for wedding flowers and champagne. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the street where she'd lived for 28 years. Porch lights glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, and she could see the Hendersons walking their dog, Mrs. Chun watering her flower boxes, the Wilson teenagers shooting basketball in their driveway. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that in the house with the blue shutters and the carefully tended rose garden, a woman was slowly coming to terms with the fact that her only child had become her enemy. Tomorrow she would go to the jewelry store and learn what Robert Klein had discovered. Tonight, she would sit with her grief and her growing anger, and she would remember what Thomas had always told her during the difficult times. "You're stronger than you know, Margaret. You just have to decide to believe it." The house settled around her with its familiar nighttime sounds, but for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret didn't feel entirely alone. Somewhere in the shadows of her bewilderment, something harder was taking shape. Not just sorrow, but resolve. Not just love betrayed, but dignity preparing to defend itself. She had raised Conrad with infinite patience and sacrifice. She had loved him unconditionally, supported his dreams, celebrated his successes, and forgiven his failures. But she would not let him destroy her. Not while she still had breath in her body and Thomas's memory to honor. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight would bring the last of her tears. The morning air carried the scent of rain as Margaret walked down 5th Street, her handbag clutched tightly against her side. She barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling while questions circled her mind like vultures. What could Robert Klein possibly want to discuss? Had Conrad lied about selling the ring? Had someone stolen it instead? The jewelry store sat between a bakery and a used bookshop, its window display glinting with gold and diamonds that caught the weak sunlight. Margaret paused outside, watching her reflection in the glass. A 70-year-old woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the navy dress Thomas had always said brought out her eyes. She looked tired but determined, and that would have to be enough. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and immediately she was surrounded by the hushed atmosphere of expensive things. Display cases lined the walls, filled with engagement rings and watches, necklaces that sparkled like captured starlight. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s with kind eyes and careful hands. Robert Klein, she presumed. Mrs. Whitmore? His voice was gentle, the same tone she'd heard on the phone. Thank you for coming. Please have a seat. He gestured to a small consultation area at the back of the store, away from the main displays. Margaret settled into the cushioned chair, her hands folded in her lap, trying to appear calmer than she felt. Robert disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a manila envelope and something wrapped in black velvet. Margaret's breath caught. She recognized the velvet box immediately. It was Thomas's ring box, the one that had sat on their dresser for over 4 decades. I need to explain something, Robert began, settling into the chair across from her. Your son did bring your husband's ring here 3 days ago, but he wasn't the first member of your family to visit my shop. Margaret's brow furrowed. I don't understand. Robert unwrapped the velvet box and placed it on the small table between them. Margaret's heart lurched. There was Thomas's ring, the diamond catching the light just as it had on their wedding day. But how was that possible? Your husband came to see me 8 months ago, Robert continued, his voice measured and careful. He was concerned about some things he'd overheard, some conversations that worried him deeply. He asked me to hold on to this ring and these documents with very specific instructions. He opened the manila envelope and withdrew a letter written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the careful script he'd used for grocery lists and birthday cards. He said that if anyone other than you ever tried to sell this ring, I should contact you immediately. He was very clear about that, very concerned about what might happen after his death. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the letter. The paper felt heavy, weighted with importance and dread. What did he overhear? Robert's expression darkened. Mrs. Whitmore, I think you should read his letter first. Then we can discuss what he asked me to do. With shaking fingers, Margaret unfolded the letter. Thomas's words swam before her eyes, and she had to blink several times before they came into focus. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true. I hoped I was wrong about Conrad, hoped that what I overheard was just wedding stress or financial pressure talking. But I couldn't take the chance of leaving you unprotected. For weeks ago, I heard Conrad on the phone in our kitchen. He thought I was napping in the den, but his voice carried. He was talking to Charlotte about money troubles, about debts that were spiraling out of control. But it was what he said next that broke my heart. He said, once the old man dies, we'll have to move fast. Mom's getting older, more confused. It won't be hard to convince people she can't handle her finances anymore. Margaret's vision blurred. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each one a small knife cutting into her understanding of the world. She forced herself to continue reading. I've spent the last 2 months quietly investigating our son's finances. What I found terrifies me. Gambling debts, Margaret. Serious ones. Conrad owes money to people who don't accept payment plans. Charlotte's family isn't wealthy like she pretends. They're in debt too, trying to maintain an image they can't afford. I've hired a private investigator to document everything. The evidence is in our safety deposit box at Commerce Trust Bank, along with my life insurance policy and other documents you'll need. The investigator's name is Michael Bradley, and his number is at the bottom of this letter. I'm sorry to burden you with this knowledge, but I couldn't leave you defenseless. Our son is planning to have you declared incompetent so he can control your finances. He's already started telling people you're forgetful and confused. Don't let him gaslight you, Margaret. You are as sharp as you've ever been. The ring is just the beginning. Protect yourself. Trust the evidence. And remember that no matter what Conrad says or does, you are not alone. All my love, Thomas. The letter slipped from Margaret's numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. The room seemed to tilt around her, reality reshaping itself into something darker and more frightening than she'd imagined. Thomas had known. He'd spent his final months watching their son plan her destruction, carrying that terrible knowledge alone. Mrs. Whitmore? Robert's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? Margaret pressed her hands to her cheeks, feeling the tears she hadn't realized she was crying. He knew, she whispered. Thomas knew what Conrad was planning. Robert nodded grimly. He was a very thorough man. He gave me copies of phone records, photographs, financial documents. He said Conrad had been meeting with lawyers, asking about guardianship procedures and power of attorney laws. Gambling debts, Margaret said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. Conrad told me he needed money for the wedding, but it's gambling debts. According to your husband's investigation, yes. Substantial ones. Conrad borrowed against his credit cards, took out a second mortgage on his condo, even borrowed from his retirement account. But it wasn't enough. He needs a significant sum of money very quickly, or he's going to face serious consequences. Margaret thought about Conrad's expensive suits, Charlotte's designer purse, the talk of a $15,000 wedding venue. All of it built on borrowed money and desperation, a house of cards waiting to collapse. How much? She asked quietly. Robert consulted a paper from the envelope. Nearly $200,000 at the time of your husband's investigation. The private investigator believes it's likely grown since then. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. $200,000 or more. More money than Thomas had made in 5 years. More than they'd ever seen at one time in their entire marriage. No wonder Conrad was desperate. No wonder he was willing to destroy his own mother to save himself. There's more, Robert said gently. Your husband suspected that Conrad might try to isolate you, to make your friends and neighbors doubt your mental capacity. Has that started happening? Margaret's throat felt raw. Yesterday, Conrad told my neighbor I was having memory problems. She called last night to check on me, but I could hear it in her voice. She already believed I was losing my mind. I'm sorry. Thomas was afraid of that. He said Conrad was very good at manipulation, at making people see what he wanted them to see. Margaret picked up the ring box and opened it. Thomas's wedding band gleamed against the velvet lining, looking exactly as it had the day he'd slipped it onto her finger. How did you get it back? Conrad said he sold it. I bought it from him for exactly what he was asking, $5,000. It's worth considerably more, but Conrad was in a hurry. He didn't question my price or ask for an appraisal. He just wanted the cash. $5,000. Thomas had saved for 8 months to buy this ring, working overtime and skipping lunches, so proud when he could finally afford it. Conrad had sold it in a matter of minutes for a fraction of its emotional value, all for money he'd waste on temporary pleasures. What am I supposed to do? Margaret asked, her voice small. If Conrad owes that much money, if he's this desperate, you're supposed to protect yourself, Robert said firmly. Your husband left you tools to do that. The first step is getting to that safety deposit box and seeing what other evidence he collected. Margaret nodded, slipping the ring onto her finger where it belonged. The weight felt familiar and comforting, like Thomas's hand holding hers. Michael Bradley, the private investigator. I have his card right here. Thomas said to tell you that Bradley has been expecting your call. He has additional information that wasn't safe to keep in writing. As Margaret stood to leave, Robert caught her arm gently. Mrs. Whitmore? Your husband loved you very much. Everything he did, all the investigating and planning, it was because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving you vulnerable. Don't let Conrad make you doubt that love or your own strength. Outside the jewelry store, Margaret stood on the sidewalk feeling as though she'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. The ring on her finger caught the sunlight, but its sparkle couldn't chase away the shadows that had fallen across her world. Conrad wasn't just selfish or thoughtless. He was actively plotting against her. The son she'd raised with infinite love and patience was willing to destroy her life to save his own. Her phone buzzed in her purse. A text message from Conrad. Mom, Charlotte and I want to take you to lunch today. We think we should talk about getting you some help around the house. Someone to assist with bills and appointments. 1 p.m. at Miller's Cafe. Margaret stared at the message, reading between the lines. Help with bills and appointments. The first step toward taking control of her finances. They weren't wasting any time. She typed back, I'm busy today. Perhaps another time. The response came within seconds. This is important, Mom. We're worried about you. Margaret turned off her phone and walked to her car, Thomas's ring solid and reassuring on her finger. Let Conrad worry. Let him wonder why she wasn't falling in line with his carefully laid plans. She had investigating to do, evidence to collect, and a battle to prepare for. For the first time since Thomas's funeral, Margaret felt something stirring inside her that wasn't grief or confusion. It was anger, pure and righteous, and it felt like coming alive. The Commerce Trust Bank lobby felt like a cathedral, all marble columns and hushed reverence for money and secrets. Margaret's heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the receptionist. Thomas's letter folded carefully in her purse along with the key he'd hidden in his desk drawer. I need to access my safety deposit box, she told the young woman behind the counter, her voice steadier than she felt. Of course. Box number? 17. Margaret had memorized the number from Thomas's letter, along with everything else he'd written in his careful script. The descent into the vault felt like traveling into another world, one where normal rules didn't apply and terrible truths waited in metal boxes. The bank employee led her to a small private room and left her alone with the rectangular container that held Thomas's final gifts to her. Margaret's hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside were manila folders, USB drives, and a thick envelope marked life insurance, read first in Thomas's handwriting. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers and nearly dropped it when she saw the amount. $2 million. $2 million. The number swam before her eyes, incomprehensible in its magnitude. Thomas had carried a modest life insurance policy through his employer, something she'd assumed would cover funeral expenses and maybe pay off their small mortgage. She'd never imagined this. A note was clipped to the policy. Margaret, I upgraded this policy 3 years ago when I first noticed changes in Conrad's behavior. You'll never have to worry about money, no matter what our son tries to do. Use this freedom to protect yourself. T. Margaret pressed the paper to her chest, tears blurring her vision. Even in death, Thomas was still taking care of her, still thinking 3 steps ahead. Conrad could scheme and manipulate all he wanted. She had resources now that he couldn't even imagine. The first folder contained photographs that made her stomach clench. Conrad meeting with men in expensive suits outside legal offices. Charlotte at a casino, chips stacked in front of her on a poker table. Bank statements showing cash advances and wire transfers. A paper trail of desperation and poor choices. The second folder held transcripts of recorded phone conversations. Margaret recognized Conrad's voice immediately, but the cold calculation in his words made him sound like a stranger. The old man can't live forever. When he goes, Mom will be vulnerable. Grief makes people confused, malleable. We just need to establish a pattern of forgetfulness, get a few neighbors to voice concerns about her mental state. Charlotte's voice responded. How long do you think we have before the casino people get impatient? 6 months, maybe less. But Mom's house is worth at least $400,000. Once we get conservatorship, we can sell it, pay off our debts, and still have enough left over for the wedding we want. Margaret's hands clenched around the transcript. Her home, the place where she'd raised Conrad, where every room held memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and quiet family dinners, was nothing more than a commodity to him. She was nothing more than an obstacle to his financial salvation. The third folder contained reports from Michael Bradley, the private investigator. Page after page of detailed surveillance, financial records, and documented meetings. Conrad had been planning this for over a year, slowly building a case for her incompetency while accumulating debt at an alarming rate. One report detailed a meeting between Conrad and a lawyer specializing in elder law. The notes were chilling. Subject inquired about expedited guardianship procedures. Asked specifically about timeline for declaring parent mentally incapacitated. Seemed particularly interested in cases involving recent widowhood and depression. Margaret felt sick. Conrad hadn't just been planning to steal from her. He'd been researching the most efficient way to do it legally. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Conrad. "Mom, you missed lunch. We're coming by the house at 4 p.m. to check on you. Please be there." The presumption in his message, that he could simply announce his arrival and expect her compliance, made Margaret's anger flare brighter. She gathered the folders and USB drives, locked them securely in her purse, and headed home to prepare for battle. Back in her kitchen, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat at the table where she'd fed Conrad breakfast every morning for 18 years. The boy who'd once hugged her legs and begged for just one more bedtime story was coming to her house today to begin the process of taking her freedom away. At exactly 4 o'clock, she heard Conrad's BMW pull into her driveway. Through the window, she watched him and Charlotte approach her front door, their faces set with grim determination. They looked like people preparing for an unpleasant but necessary task. Margaret opened the door before they could knock. "Conrad." "Charlotte." "Mom." Conrad's voice carried forced warmth. "We were worried when you didn't show up for lunch. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine. I had errands to run." Charlotte stepped forward, her smile bright and predatory. "We brought you something." She held up a basket filled with prepared meals from an upscale grocery store. "We thought you might not be eating properly. Grief can affect appetite, and at your age, proper nutrition is so important." The patronizing tone made Margaret's teeth clench, but she stepped aside to let them in. How thoughtful. They settled in her living room, Conrad and Charlotte on the sofa, Margaret in Thomas's chair. The dynamic felt like an intervention, and Margaret realized that's exactly what this was. The opening salvo in their campaign to declare her incompetent. "Mom, we need to talk about some practical matters," Conrad began, his voice gentle but firm. "You're living alone in this big house, managing finances, dealing with grief. We think it might be time to consider getting you some help." "What kind of help?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Charlotte leaned forward, her expression radiating false concern. "Well, for instance, we noticed you forgot about our lunch appointment today. And Mrs. Caldwell mentioned you seemed confused when she spoke to you yesterday. Small things, but they add up." "I didn't forget anything," Margaret said quietly. "I chose not to come." Conrad exchanged a look with Charlotte. "Mom, that's exactly what we're talking about. You're not remembering conversations clearly. Yesterday you asked Mrs. Caldwell twice if she'd seen your mail carrier, and you've been telling people Dad is just away on business instead of acknowledging that he's gone." The lies came so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a moment Margaret doubted her own memory. Then she remembered Thomas's letter, the evidence in her purse, the cold calculation in Conrad's recorded voice. "I've never said your father was away on business," she said firmly. "And I've never asked Mrs. Caldwell about the mail carrier." "You're lying." Conrad's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of irritation before the concerned expression returned. "See? This is what we're worried about. You're becoming defensive, paranoid even. It's not your fault. Grief can cause these symptoms. But we need to address them before they get worse." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Margaret kept her voice level, curious to hear their plan laid out in their own words. Charlotte pulled a folder from her oversized purse. "We've scheduled an appointment with Dr. Reynolds for next week. Just a routine checkup, but we'd like to discuss your mental state with him. And we think it might be wise to start having someone help with your bills and banking. Just temporarily, until you're feeling more like yourself." There it was. The first concrete step toward taking control of her finances. Margaret felt a cold fury settle in her chest, sharp and clarifying. "I see," she said. "And who would help with my bills?" "Well, I have power of attorney experience from handling Charlotte's grandmother's affairs," Conrad said smoothly. "It would be temporary, just until you're back on your feet emotionally." Margaret stood slowly, moving to the window that looked out on her garden. Thomas's roses were blooming, red and pink and white, just as they had every June for 20 years. He'd pruned them and fed them and talked to them like old friends, and they'd rewarded his care with beauty that lasted from spring until the first frost. "No," she said quietly, still looking at the roses. "I'm sorry." Conrad's voice carried surprise and the beginning of impatience. Margaret turned to face them, and something in her expression made Charlotte sit back against the sofa cushions. I said no. I don't need help with my bills. I don't need someone to manage my finances. And I certainly don't need you to lie to my doctor about my mental state. Conrad stood, his composure cracking. Mom, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you. Like you helped me by selling your father's ring? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Conrad's face flushed, but he recovered quickly. That ring was just sitting in a drawer. We needed the money, and it wasn't doing anyone any good gathering dust. It was doing me good, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. It was the last piece of your father I had, and you sold it without asking, without caring what it meant to me. Charlotte stood and moved to Conrad's side, presenting a united front. Mrs. Whitmore, we understand you're emotional, but you have to think practically. Conrad and I are young, we have expenses, we're building a life together. You're 70 years old. How much time do you really need to grieve over a piece of jewelry? The callousness of the statement struck Margaret like a slap. This woman, who'd never worked a day in her life, who lived on credit cards and borrowed money, was lecturing her about being practical. Get out, Margaret said quietly. What? Conrad blinked as though he'd misheard. I said get out of my house. Both of you. Conrad's facade finally crumbled completely, revealing the desperate, angry man underneath. Fine. But this isn't over, Mom. You're clearly not capable of making rational decisions right now. We'll be back, and next time we'll have Dr. Reynolds with us. As they moved toward the door, Charlotte turned back with a smile that held no warmth at all. We really do love you, Mrs. Whitmore. Sometimes love means making hard choices for people who can't make them for themselves. After they left, Margaret sat in Thomas's chair and listened to the silence of her house. Outside, the roses bloomed in defiant beauty, and somewhere in her purse, evidence of her son's betrayal waited like a loaded gun. Tomorrow she would call Michael Bradley. Tomorrow she would begin to fight back. Tonight, she would sit with her grief and her anger and her growing determination to protect what Thomas had died trying to preserve. The war for her freedom had officially begun. Michael Bradley's office occupied the second floor of a modest building downtown, sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a small law firm. Margaret climbed the narrow stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hallway smelled of old coffee and industrial carpet, nothing like the polished marble of the bank or the elegant atmosphere of the jewelry store. This felt real, unvarnished, the kind of place where hard truths lived. Bradley himself was younger than she'd expected, maybe 50, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much of humanity's darker impulses. His handshake was firm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who dealt in facts rather than comfortable lies. Mrs. Whitmore, Thomas spoke about you often during our meetings. He was very concerned about protecting you. Margaret settled into the worn leather chair across from his desk. He left me evidence, but Robert Klein suggested there was more. Bradley nodded, unlocking a filing cabinet that looked like it had survived several decades. Your husband was thorough, but he died before we could complete the investigation. What I found in the last 6 months, well, it changes everything. He pulled out a thick folder and spread its contents across his desk. Photographs, bank statements, and what looked like legal documents created a mosaic of deception that made Margaret's stomach clench. Conrad's gambling problem is worse than Thomas knew, Bradley began, pointing to a series of bank statements. These are from accounts your son thought were private. Since your husband's death 6 months ago, the debts have escalated dramatically. Margaret studied the numbers, watching her son's financial world collapse in black and white. How much worse? $300,000. And the interest is compounding daily. The number hit her like a physical blow. It had grown by $100,000 since Thomas's investigation. My God! But that's not the worst part. Bradley's expression darkened as he pulled out a series of photographs. 2 weeks ago, Conrad met with a man named Vincent Russo. Russo runs a debt collection service that operates in the gray areas of the law. They had lunch at Romano's downtown, and my telephoto lens caught some interesting details. The photographs showed Conrad sitting across from a heavy-set man in an expensive suit. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the tension in her son's posture, the way his hands shook as he reached for his water glass. Russo specializes in helping people liquidate assets quickly when they're under pressure, Bradley continued. Houses, businesses, anything that can be converted to cash without too many questions. Conrad didn't just stumble into debt. He's been guided into this situation by people who profit from desperation. Margaret's blood ran cold. You're saying this was planned? I'm saying your son got involved with dangerous people who saw an opportunity. A young man with expensive tastes, a gambling problem, and a mother who owns valuable real estate. They've been enabling his addiction while calculating how much they can extract from your family's assets. Bradley pulled out another document, a real estate appraisal for Margaret's house. Her address, her property, analyzed and valued like a commodity on an auction block. Conrad had your house appraised 2 weeks ago. He told the appraiser he was helping his elderly mother understand her assets for estate planning purposes. The betrayal cut deeper than anything yet. While she'd been grieving Thomas's loss, while the 6-month mark of his death had passed with fresh waves of sorrow, Conrad had been calculating the value of everything she owned. Her home wasn't sanctuary to him, it was collateral. There's more, Bradley said gently. I've been monitoring Conrad's communications since Thomas hired me. Yesterday, after your confrontation, he made several phone calls. One was to Dr. Reynolds's office, requesting an urgent appointment to discuss his mother's deteriorating mental state. Another was to a lawyer who specializes in expedited guardianship proceedings. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. How quickly can they move? If they can establish a pattern of incapacity, if they can get a doctor to agree that you're unable to manage your affairs, they could have preliminary guardianship within 2 weeks. Once that's in place, Conrad would have legal authority to sell your house, access your accounts, make medical decisions on your behalf. The room seemed to tilt around Margaret. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, she could lose everything, her home, her independence, her dignity. She'd become a prisoner in her own life, dependent on the son who was systematically destroying her. But, Bradley continued, his voice taking on a different tone, your husband anticipated this. He didn't just want evidence of Conrad's debts and lies. He wanted insurance. Bradley unlocked another drawer and withdrew a small digital recorder. Thomas asked me to set up surveillance in your home 4 months ago. Audio recording devices in the kitchen, living room, and Conrad's old bedroom, the places where he was most likely to have private conversations. Margaret's eyes widened. Thomas bugged our house? With your consent, which he obtained by telling you he was installing a new security system. You signed the papers, Mrs. Whitmore. It's all legal. The memory came flooding back. Thomas fussing with small devices he'd said were motion sensors, asking her to sign insurance forms for the upgraded security system. She'd been happy to let him handle the details, trusting as always in his careful attention to their safety. Bradley pressed play on the recorder. Conrad's voice filled the small office, clear and unmistakable. Mom's completely lost it since Dad died. Yesterday she couldn't remember what year it was, and she's been leaving the stove on constantly. I found her wandering around the neighborhood at midnight in her nightgown, completely confused about where she was. Charlotte's voice responded, Perfect. Dr. Reynolds needs to hear about these incidents. The more specific details we can provide, the easier it'll be to get the competency evaluation. The best part is she doesn't even realize how bad it's gotten. She actually thinks she's fine. Classic dementia behavior. No insight into her own condition. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Every word was a calculated lie, designed to paint her as incapacitated and helpless. The casual cruelty in Conrad's voice, the way he and Charlotte laughed about her supposed confusion, made her feel physically sick. Bradley stopped the recording. I have hours of this, Mrs. Whitmore. Detailed discussions about forging medical records, bribing witnesses to testify about your mental state, even plans to slip medication into your food to make you appear more confused during doctor visits. The final revelation hit Margaret like a sledgehammer. They weren't just planning to lie about her condition. They were planning to drug her to create the symptoms they claimed she already had. My own son, she whispered, her voice breaking. My own son was going to poison me. Bradley's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. Mrs. Whitmore, what Conrad is planning isn't just theft or fraud. It's abuse, conspiracy, and potentially assault. We have enough evidence here to send him to prison for years. Margaret sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of her son's betrayal. This wasn't about wedding expenses or even gambling debts anymore. This was about a young man who'd lost his way so completely that he was willing to destroy his own mother to save himself from the consequences of his own choices. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Bradley leaned forward, his expression serious but not without hope. "We go on the offensive. Thomas left you more than evidence, Mrs. Whitmore. He left you the tools to not just defend yourself, but to take complete control of the situation." He pulled out one final document, a power of attorney form with Thomas's signature, dated just 3 weeks before his death. "Your husband transferred his investigative contract to you. That means all of my findings, all of the surveillance evidence, everything I've collected belongs to you now. And Mrs. Whitmore," Bradley smiled grimly, "I've been very thorough." Margaret looked at the evidence spread across Bradley's desk, photographs, recordings, financial documents, legal papers. It was an arsenal of truth that could destroy Conrad's plans completely. But it was also the ammunition to destroy her son's life, to send him to prison, to sever their relationship forever. The choice stretched before her like a chasm. She could use this evidence to protect herself, but doing so would mean accepting that the little boy she'd raised was truly gone, replaced by someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. Bradley seemed to read her thoughts. "Mrs. Whitmore, your son made his choices. Now you have to make yours. The question is, are you going to let him destroy you to save himself, or are you going to save yourself and let him face the consequences of his actions?" Margaret thought of Thomas, of the way he'd held her hand during the difficult times, the way he'd always said she was stronger than she knew. She thought of her home, filled with 43 years of memories, of the roses blooming in her garden, of the life she'd built with love and sacrifice and patience. Conrad had chosen his path. The escalating debt, the dangerous associates, the willingness to drug his own mother. These weren't desperate mistakes anymore. They were calculated choices made by someone who'd lost all connection to the values she'd tried to teach him. "What do we do first?" she asked, her voice steady for the first time in months. Bradley's smile was sharp as a blade. "We give your son exactly what he's been asking for. We arrange for him to get all the attention he deserves." Margaret's phone rang at 7 in the morning, jarring her from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. Bradley's evidence was safely locked in her bedroom safe, but knowing the truth about Conrad's plans hadn't brought her peace. It had brought a terrible clarity that made every shadow in her house feel threatening. "Mrs. Whitmore? This is Dr. Reynolds' office. We need to reschedule your appointment from this afternoon to 10 o'clock this morning. Dr. Reynolds had a cancellation and wants to see you as soon as possible." Margaret's blood ran cold. She hadn't made any appointment with Dr. Reynolds. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. I didn't schedule an appointment." "Oh," the receptionist sounded confused. "Let me check. Yes, it says here that your son Conrad called yesterday requesting an urgent evaluation for you. He said you've been having memory issues and confusion since your husband's passing." The trap was closing faster than Bradley had predicted. Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "I don't need an evaluation. Please cancel whatever appointment my son made." "Mrs. Whitmore, are you sure?" Conrad seemed very concerned. He mentioned some specific incidents that worried him. "Cancel it," Margaret said firmly and hung up. Within minutes, her phone rang again. Conrad's number flashed on the screen. "Mom, Dr. Reynolds' office just called me. Why did you cancel your appointment?" Margaret's anger flared. "Because I didn't make an appointment, Conrad. You did. Without asking me. You need medical attention. Yesterday you seemed confused, disoriented. Charlotte and I are worried sick about you." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Conrad's voice carried a new edge, less pretend concern and more barely controlled frustration. "Mom, whether you like it or not, we're coming to get you at 9:30. You're going to see Dr. Reynolds, and we're going to get you the help you need." The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her hands trembling. They weren't asking anymore, they were demanding. And if Bradley was right about their timeline, this doctor's visit was the first step toward having her declared incompetent. She called Bradley immediately. They moved up their timeline. "Conrad made a doctor's appointment for me this morning without my consent. Can you avoid going? They're coming to get me. Conrad said whether I like it or not." Bradley's silence stretched for a long moment. Mrs. Whitmore, if they physically force you to that appointment, if Dr. Reynolds observes you under duress and interprets your distress as confusion or agitation, it could seriously damage our case. Frightened people often appear disoriented. What should I do? Go with them. But wear the wire I gave you yesterday. Record everything. And whatever you do, stay calm. Don't give them any ammunition. An hour later, Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Conrad's BMW, the tiny recording device Bradley had provided hidden in her purse. Charlotte drove while Conrad twisted in the front seat to face her, his expression a mask of concerned care that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, I want you to know that whatever Dr. Reynolds recommends will support you," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that made Margaret's skin crawl. "If he thinks you need assisted living or someone to help manage your medications, we'll find the best possible care for you." "I don't take any medications," Margaret said quietly. Conrad exchanged a look with Charlotte. "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You've been on blood pressure medication for 3 years." The lie came so smoothly, so confidently, that for a moment Margaret doubted herself. Then she remembered Bradley's warning about their plan to slip drugs into her food, to create symptoms that would support their claims. "I've never taken blood pressure medication," she said firmly. "Mom." Conrad's voice carried practiced patience, the tone of someone dealing with a confused elderly person. "You started taking it after Dad's retirement party. Remember? Dr. Reynolds said your readings were elevated." Margaret pressed her lips together. Every word she spoke would be twisted. Every moment of normal human emotion would be reinterpreted as evidence of declining mental capacity. The silence felt safer. Charlotte placed a manicured hand on Conrad's arm, a gesture that looked supportive but felt like a performance. "Maybe we should talk to Dr. Reynolds about getting her evaluated by a specialist, just to be safe." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that made Margaret's pulse quicken. A specialist. The suggestion hung in the air with all the weight of threat and consequence. Conrad nodded slowly, as though the idea had just occurred to him. "That's not a bad idea. Someone objective could help us figure out the best way to take care of you. Take care of her." The phrase should have sounded loving, protective. Instead, it felt like a cage closing around her freedom. Margaret looked from her son to his fiancée, these two people who were transporting her like cargo to an appointment she'd never agreed to make. The morning sun streamed through the car windows, but the interior felt cold despite the summer heat. Dr. Reynolds's waiting room was decorated in soothing pastels, filled with the kind of generic landscape paintings that were meant to calm patients, but only reminded Margaret of how artificial this whole situation felt. She'd known Reynolds for 20 years, had trusted him with her family's health, and now Conrad was turning even that relationship into a weapon against her. When they were called back, Conrad immediately took charge of the conversation. "Dr. Reynolds, thank you for seeing Mom on such short notice. Charlotte and I are really concerned about her mental state since Dad died." Dr. Reynolds, a kindly man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, looked at Margaret with gentle concern. "How are you feeling, Margaret? Conrad mentioned you've been having some difficulties." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I'm grieving my husband of 43 years, doctor. But my mind is perfectly clear." Conrad leaned forward. "Mom, yesterday you told Mrs. Caldwell that Dad was just away on a business trip. And you've been forgetting conversations, repeating yourself. Last week you left the stove on and nearly set the house on fire." Each lie was delivered with such convincing worry that Margaret watched Dr. Reynolds's expression grow more concerned. She wanted to scream, to demand proof, to call Conrad out for his manipulation. But she knew that any show of emotion would be interpreted as agitation, further evidence of her supposed decline. "I've never told anyone my husband was on a business trip," she said calmly. "I've never left the stove on. And I remember every conversation I've had in the past week with perfect clarity." Dr. Reynolds made notes on his chart. "Margaret, can you tell me what day it is?" "Wednesday, June 15th. It's 10:20 in the morning, and I'm here because my son made an appointment for me without my knowledge or consent." "And who is the current president?" Margaret answered each question correctly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. This was humiliating, being tested like a child while her son sat nearby nodding sympathetically. "Mom," Conrad said gently, "Dr. Reynolds is just trying to help. You don't need to be defensive." There it was, the perfect trap. If she answered calmly, Conrad would point to her emotional distance as evidence of disconnection from reality. If she showed frustration, it would be interpreted as agitation and confusion. Either way, she lost. Dr. Reynolds continued his evaluation, asking about her sleep patterns, her appetite, her daily routines. Margaret answered honestly. Yes, she'd been sleeping poorly since Thomas died. Yes, she sometimes forgot to eat lunch. Yes, she felt lonely and sad. These are all normal grief responses, Dr. Reynolds said finally. Margaret, I don't see any evidence of cognitive impairment. You seem alert, oriented, and appropriately responsive to your circumstances. Relief flooded through Margaret, but Conrad wasn't finished. Doctor, with respect, you didn't see her last night. She was wandering around the house at 2 a.m, completely confused about where she was. She asked me 3 times who I was. Dr. Reynolds's expression shifted. Is that true, Margaret? No. Margaret's voice was steady, but she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. I was in my bedroom all night. Conrad wasn't even at my house last night. Conrad pulled out his phone. I have photos, doctor. I was so worried about her that I went to check on her. He showed the screen to Dr. Reynolds, blurry images that Margaret couldn't see clearly from her angle. This is Mom at 2:15 this morning, standing in her kitchen in her nightgown, completely disoriented. Margaret's blood turned to ice. The photos could be of anyone, taken anywhere, at any time. But they looked convincing enough to plant doubt in Dr. Reynolds's mind. Margaret, Dr. Reynolds said gently, do you remember getting up last night? I sleep through the night. I always have. But even as she said it, Margaret could hear how defensive she sounded. Conrad had trapped her perfectly, deny his lies and sound paranoid, or admit confusion she'd never experienced. Charlotte spoke for the first time, her voice trembling with fake emotion. Dr. Reynolds, we love her so much. We just want her to be safe. If something happened to her because we didn't act. Dr. Reynolds set down his pen and looked at Margaret with the kind of gentle concern that felt like a death sentence. Margaret, I think we should run some additional tests. Blood work, maybe a brain scan. And I'd like to see you again next week for a follow-up evaluation. Is that necessary? Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Given the incidents Conrad described, yes. I think it's prudent to rule out any underlying medical causes for these symptoms. As they left the doctor's office, Conrad's mask finally slipped completely. In the parking lot, he grabbed Margaret's arm with enough force to leave bruises. You embarrassed me in there, he hissed. Making me look like a liar when I'm trying to help you. You are lying, Margaret said, trying to pull away from his grip. And you're delusional if you think you can keep fighting us on this. His eyes held no warmth, no trace of the boy she'd raised. We're going to get that competency evaluation, Mom. One way or another. Charlotte unlocked the car doors. Get in. We're taking you home, and we're going to have a serious conversation about your future. Margaret sat in the back seat like a prisoner, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood blur past through tears she refused to let fall. Conrad and Charlotte spoke in low, urgent voices in the front seat, planning her destruction while she sat helpless behind them. At her house, they followed her inside, no longer pretending this was a social visit. Mom, sit down, Conrad commanded, pointing to Thomas's chair. We need to talk. Margaret remained standing. This is my house. You don't give me orders here. Conrad's laugh was bitter. Your house? Mom, you can barely remember what day it is. You think you can manage property taxes and insurance and maintenance? You're living in a fantasy. Charlotte produced papers from her purse, the same power of attorney documents they'd tried to get her to sign before. Mrs. Whitmore, we're trying to do this the easy way. You can sign these papers voluntarily, and we'll help you transition to a nice assisted living facility. You'll be comfortable, safe, and we'll visit regularly. And if I don't sign? Conrad's expression hardened. Then we'll get a court order. Dr. Reynolds is going to recommend a competency evaluation, and when that evaluation shows what we already know, that you're not capable of caring for yourself, the court will appoint me as your guardian anyway. The only difference is that fighting us will cost you thousands in legal fees. Margaret looked around her living room, at the photographs on the mantelpiece, at Thomas's chair where she'd found comfort for so many years. This was the room where she'd read bedtime stories to Conrad, where they'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where she'd held him while he cried over his first heartbreak. Now he stood in that same room, threatening to take everything from her. "You have 24 hours, Conrad continued. "Sign the papers, or we file for emergency guardianship tomorrow morning. Either way, this ends." As they prepared to leave, Charlotte turned back with that cold smile Margaret had come to dread. "Oh, and Mrs. Whitmore? We had the locks changed on your house this morning. For your safety, of course. You wouldn't want to wander outside in the middle of the night and not be able to get back in." The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Margaret sank into Thomas's chair and finally let the tears fall. They'd trapped her completely. No matter what she did, they would win. If she signed the papers, she lost everything. If she fought them, they'd drag her through a competency hearing where Conrad's lies and Dr. Reynolds's concerns would be weighed against her denials. For the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret felt truly alone. The evidence Bradley had collected might clear her name eventually, but it couldn't save her from the immediate threat. Conrad was moving too fast, and the system was too willing to believe that a grieving widow might be losing her mind. Outside, the sun was setting behind the trees, and Margaret's roses glowed in the fading light. Thomas had planted those roses the year Conrad graduated from college, talking about how they'd bloom long after he was gone, a legacy of beauty that would outlast them all. Now even that legacy was threatened. In 24 hours, Conrad would own her house, her finances, her very freedom. And there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop him. Margaret sat in Thomas's chair until the house grew dark around her, the weight of Conrad's ultimatum pressing down like a physical force. 24 hours. Sign away her freedom, or have it taken by force. The choice felt like no choice at all, surrender or be crushed. But as the clock on the mantelpiece chimed 9 times, something stirred in the depths of her despair. It started as a whisper, then grew stronger. Thomas's voice from their last real conversation, the night before his heart attack claimed him. "You're the strongest person I know, Margaret. You just forget sometimes because you're so busy taking care of everyone else." She'd been sitting at his bedside in the hospital, holding his hand while machines beeped softly around them. He'd squeezed her fingers with what little strength he had left and said, "Promise me something. When I'm gone, don't let anyone convince you that you're less than you are. Don't let them make you small." Margaret rose from the chair, her legs unsteady but her resolve crystallizing. Thomas hadn't just left her evidence to defend herself. He'd left her the tools to go on the offensive. Bradley had been clear about that. The question was whether she had the courage to use them. She picked up her phone and called Bradley's emergency number. "Mrs. Whitmore? Are you all right?" "No," she said, her voice steady for the first time in days. "But I'm done being afraid. We need to move tonight." "What happened?" Margaret told him about the doctor's visit, Conrad's ultimatum, the changed locks. With each detail, Bradley's breathing grew more audible on the other end of the line. "Those bastards," he muttered. "They're accelerating everything because they know you're not falling in line like they expected. Can we stop them?" "Mrs. Whitmore, we're going to do more than stop them. We're going to destroy them so completely that they'll never threaten anyone again. But I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" Margaret looked around her living room, at the life she and Thomas had built together, the memories that Conrad was trying to steal from her. "Yes. Tell me what to do." "First, we're getting those locks changed back. I know a locksmith who owes me a favor. He'll be there in 30 minutes. Then we're going to set a trap that will record everything Conrad says when he comes to force you to sign those papers." While they waited for the locksmith, Bradley explained the plan. It was audacious, risky, and required Margaret to act with a composure she wasn't sure she possessed. But it was also perfect. It would give Conrad exactly what he thought he wanted while exposing his true nature in the process. "The key is to let him believe he's winning," Bradley said as they tested the new recording equipment he'd brought. "Let him get comfortable. Let him reveal his real intentions. Then we'll have everything we need to bury him." The locksmith worked quickly and quietly, replacing Conrad's locks with new ones and giving Margaret fresh keys. "Your son seemed surprised when I told him this was your house, and you could change the locks whenever you wanted, he said with a knowing smile. Some people forget that ownership has its privileges. By midnight, everything was in place. Margaret sat in her kitchen, surrounded by invisible recording devices, wearing a wire that would capture every word of the confrontation to come. Bradley waited in his van down the street, monitoring the audio feeds and ready to intervene if things went too far. Remember, Bradley's voice crackled through the tiny earpiece he'd given her. You're in control here. No matter what Conrad says or does, you have the power. Don't let him make you forget that. Margaret made herself a cup of tea and waited for morning. She'd spent 6 months feeling like a victim, allowing grief and confusion to make her weak. But tonight, sitting in the house she'd shared with Thomas for 28 years, she felt something she hadn't experienced since his death. Hope. At exactly 8 o'clock, she heard Conrad's car in the driveway. Through the window, she watched him and Charlotte approach the front door with the confidence of people who believed they'd already won. Conrad tried his key first, then rattled the handle when it didn't work. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. Mom. Conrad's voice carried surprise and irritation. Why didn't my key work? Because I had the locks changed. This is my house, Conrad. Charlotte stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. You can't do that. We changed those locks for your safety. You changed them to control me. I changed them back to protect myself. Conrad pushed past her into the house, his composure finally cracking. This is exactly the kind of irrational behavior we're talking about. You're paranoid, suspicious, making decisions that don't make sense. Margaret followed them into the kitchen, where she'd set out the power of attorney papers Conrad had given her. You said I had 24 hours to decide. I've decided. Conrad's eyes lit up with triumph. Good. I knew you'd see reason eventually. Margaret picked up the papers and, with deliberate precision, tore them in half. The silence that followed was deafening. Conrad stared at the destroyed documents, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something darker. Mom, he said slowly, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Did I? Margaret sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd fed Conrad breakfast every morning for 18 years. Or did I finally start making smart decisions? Charlotte pulled out her phone. I'm calling our lawyer. This is clearly evidence of impaired judgment. Go ahead, Margaret said calmly. Call whoever you want. But you might want to reconsider your strategy first. Conrad moved closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You have no idea what you're dealing with, old woman. The people I owe money to don't accept excuses. They want payment, and they're going to get it whether you cooperate or not. There it was, the admission Bradley had been waiting for. Conrad's mask was completely gone now, revealing the desperate, dangerous man underneath. So this was never about helping me, Margaret said. It was about your gambling debts. Of course it was about the money. Conrad exploded. You think I care about your feelings? About your precious memories? You're 70 years old, Mom. How much life do you have left? I'm 35 with decades ahead of me, and I'm not going to let your sentimental attachment to junk ruin my future. Charlotte nodded in agreement. The smart thing would be to sign yourself into assisted living voluntarily. At least then you'd have some dignity left. Force us to go to court, and we'll make sure everyone knows exactly how far gone you really are. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. This was what Thomas had known would happen. That grief and pressure would eventually strip away Conrad's pretenses and reveal who he'd really become. You know what's interesting? Margaret said, reaching into her purse. I found something yesterday that I think you'll want to see. She pulled out one of Bradley's photographs, Conrad meeting with Vincent Russo at the restaurant. Conrad's face went white as he recognized the image. Where did you get that? Your father hired a private investigator before he died. He suspected what you were planning. Margaret spread more photographs across the table. Michael Bradley has been watching you for months. He knows about the gambling, the debt collectors, the lawyers you've been consulting. Conrad grabbed for the photos, but Margaret was faster, sweeping them back into her purse. He also knows about your plan to drug me, to create symptoms that would support your incompetency claim. You're bluffing, Charlotte said, but her voice lacked conviction. Margaret pulled out Bradley's audio recorder and pressed play. Conrad's voice filled the kitchen, clear and damning. The best part is she doesn't even realize how bad it's gotten. She actually thinks she's fine. Classic dementia behavior. No insight into her own condition. The color drained from Conrad's face as he listened to his own words condemning him. When the recording ended, the kitchen was silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the sound of Charlotte's sharp breathing. "How much of our conversations do you have recorded?" Conrad asked quietly. "All of them," Margaret said smoothly. "Every phone call, every visit, every meeting with lawyers and debt collectors. Your father was very thorough." Conrad sank into a chair, the fight going out of him like air from a punctured balloon. "What do you want?" For the first time in months, Margaret smiled. Not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found her footing. "I want you to leave my house and never come back. I want you to stop telling people I'm losing my mind. And I want you to face the consequences of your own choices instead of trying to make me pay for them." "I can't," Conrad whispered. "You don't understand. These people will kill me if I don't pay them." "Then you should have thought of that before you started gambling with money you didn't have," Margaret said firmly. "I'm not responsible for your bad decisions, Conrad. I'm only responsible for protecting myself from them." Charlotte stood abruptly. "This isn't over. We'll fight this in court. We'll tell everyone what you're really like, vindictive, manipulative, using your dead husband's memory to get revenge on your own son." Margaret's voice remained steady. "You do that. But when you do, I'll share these recordings with the police, the district attorney, and every reporter who's interested in a story about elder abuse and fraud. I'll also share the evidence of your gambling debts and the threats you've made. Let's see which story the public finds more compelling." Conrad looked up at her with something that might have been recognition, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the woman who'd raised him instead of the victim he'd tried to create. "You won," he said bitterly. "Are you happy now?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Her son was lost to her, probably forever. The little boy she'd loved unconditionally had been replaced by someone she barely recognized. That was a grief she'd carry for the rest of her life. But she was free. Her home was safe. Her dignity was intact. Thomas's love had protected her even from the grave, and she'd found strength she hadn't known she possessed. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not happy, but I'm not defeated either. And that's enough." As Conrad and Charlotte gathered their things to leave, Bradley's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Outstanding performance, Mrs. Whitmore. We got everything we need." Margaret touched the tiny device, taking comfort in the reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Thomas's final gift hadn't just been evidence. It had been the knowledge that someone believed in her strength enough to arm her for battle. The front door closed behind Conrad and Charlotte with a sound like finality. Margaret stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the echoes of confrontation, and realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, the house felt like her home again. The courthouse steps gleamed white in the morning sun as Margaret walked up them for the second time in a month. But this time, she wasn't walking alone. Michael Bradley flanked her right side, carrying a briefcase full of evidence, while attorney Victoria Hayes, a sharp-eyed woman Bradley had recommended, walked on her left. Today was the hearing Conrad had demanded. In a desperate move after their confrontation 3 weeks ago, he'd filed for emergency guardianship, claiming Margaret was an immediate danger to herself. What he didn't know was that Margaret had been hoping he'd make exactly this move. "Remember," Victoria Hayes said quietly as they approached the courtroom doors, "let me do most of the talking. Your job is to be exactly who you are, competent, articulate, and unshakable." Margaret nodded, touching the small recording device hidden in her blazer pocket. Bradley had insisted on backup audio just in case. "I'm ready." Inside the courtroom, Conrad sat at the petitioner's table with his lawyer, a nervous-looking man who kept shuffling papers and glancing at his watch. Charlotte was nowhere to be seen. Margaret had heard through Bradley's sources that she'd left Conrad the day after their kitchen confrontation, taking her engagement ring and what remained of their joint savings. The judge was Honorable Rebecca Torres, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. She reviewed the case file before calling the proceedings to order. "This is a petition for emergency guardianship," Judge Torres announced. "Mr. Conrad Whitmore claims his mother, Margaret Whitmore, is mentally incapacitated and poses a danger to herself. Mrs. Whitmore contests this petition." Mr. Stevens, you may present your case. Conrad's lawyer stood, his voice shaky as he began. Your Honor, Conrad Whitmore is deeply concerned about his mother's welfare. Since the death of his father 6 months ago, Mrs. Whitmore has exhibited increasingly erratic behavior, including memory loss, confusion about time and place, and dangerous incidents such as leaving appliances on unattended. Margaret watched Conrad as his lawyer spoke. Her son looked haggard, his expensive suits replaced by an ill-fitting outfit that suggested his financial situation had deteriorated even further. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. We have testimony from neighbors who've witnessed Mrs. Whitmore's confusion, Stevens continued, and documentation of concerning incidents that suggest she can no longer live safely alone. Judge Torres looked at Margaret directly. Mrs. Whitmore, how do you respond to these allegations? Victoria Hayes stood before Margaret could speak. Your Honor, my client categorically denies these allegations. Furthermore, we have evidence that this petition is part of an elaborate fraud scheme designed to steal Mrs. Whitmore's assets. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Conrad's face went pale, and his lawyer looked genuinely shocked. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Hayes, Judge Torres said. I hope you can substantiate it. We can, Your Honor. We'd like to call Michael Bradley to the stand. Bradley walked to the witness stand with the confident stride of someone who'd testified in dozens of cases. After being sworn in, Victoria Hayes began her questioning. Mr. Bradley, what is your profession? I'm a licensed private investigator with 20 years of experience in fraud and financial crimes. Were you hired by someone in the Whitmore family? Yes. Thomas Whitmore, Margaret's late husband, hired me 8 months before his death to investigate suspicious behavior by his son Conrad. Conrad's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. This is hearsay from a dead man. Your Honor, Victoria Hayes interjected, we have written contracts, recorded instructions, and documented evidence. Mr. Whitmore's concerns were well-founded, as our evidence will show. Judge Torres nodded. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Bradley. Bradley opened his briefcase and pulled out the first folder. Thomas Whitmore suspected his son was planning to have Mrs. Whitmore declared incompetent in order to access her assets. My investigation confirmed these suspicions and uncovered much more. What followed was a systematic destruction of Conrad's claims. Bradley presented bank records showing Conrad's gambling debts, photographs of his meetings with debt collectors, and financial documents proving he'd been lying about his circumstances for months. Mr. Bradley, Victoria Hayes continued, did you find evidence that Conrad Whitmore fabricated incidents to support his claims about his mother's mental state? Yes. We have audio recordings of Conrad discussing his plans to create false evidence, including plans to drug his mother to make her appear confused during medical examinations. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Conrad slumped in his chair as though he'd been physically struck. Bradley played selected clips from the recordings. Conrad's voice clear and damning as he discussed manipulating his mother's medical evaluations and isolating her from friends and neighbors. When the audio ended, Judge Torres looked at Conrad with undisguised disgust. Mr. Whitmore, these recordings appear to be your voice. Do you deny making these statements? Conrad's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Conrad shook his head and stood slowly. No, Your Honor. I don't deny it. The admission sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Margaret felt no satisfaction in her son's defeat, only a deep sadness for the man he'd become. Your Honor, Victoria Hayes said, we also have evidence that Conrad Whitmore changed the locks on his mother's home without her permission, attempted to force her to sign power of attorney documents under duress, and made false statements to medical professionals about her condition. Judge Torres reviewed the evidence Bradley had compiled, photographs, bank statements, medical records, and most damning of all, the recordings of Conrad planning his mother's financial destruction. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge said finally, would you please approach the bench? Margaret walked forward, her legs steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed extensive evidence about your mental capacity, your financial management, and your living situation. Can you tell me, in your own words, why you believe you're capable of managing your own affairs? Margaret looked back at Conrad, seeing not the desperate man who'd threatened her, but the little boy she'd once rocked to sleep when thunderstorms frightened him. Your Honor, I've managed my household finances for 43 years. I balanced our checkbook, paid our taxes, maintained our property, and made countless decisions both large and small. My husband's death was devastating, but it didn't erase my intelligence or my competence. I'm grieving, but I'm not incapacitated. She paused, choosing her words carefully. What my son attempted to do to me wasn't born from love or concern. It was born from desperation and greed. But even knowing that, even understanding how far he's fallen, I hope he can find a way to rebuild his life honestly instead of by destroying mine. Judge Torres nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, I find you to be articulate, mentally competent, and fully capable of managing your own affairs. This petition for guardianship is not only denied, it appears to be fraudulent in nature. She turned her stern gaze to Conrad. Mr. Whitmore, the evidence presented today suggests you've committed multiple crimes, including attempted fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. I'm ordering this case file transferred to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Conrad's lawyer immediately began damage control, asking for time to work out a plea agreement, but Judge Torres was unmoved. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm granting Mrs. Whitmore's request for a restraining order. Mr. Whitmore, you are prohibited from contacting your mother, visiting her property, or interfering with her financial affairs in any way. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. As the gavel fell, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Complete and total victory. Not just legal victory, but the vindication of every choice she'd made since Thomas's death. Outside the courthouse, Bradley clapped her gently on the shoulder. How does it feel to be a free woman, Mrs. Whitmore? Margaret looked back at the building where her son was probably conferring with his lawyer about plea bargains and prison sentences. It feels like justice, she said quietly, but it doesn't feel like happiness. Victoria Hayes gathered her papers efficiently. The criminal charges will take months to work through the system, but with the evidence we have, Conrad will likely face serious prison time. The debt collectors he owes money to will have to find other ways to get paid. Margaret nodded, understanding that Conrad's real punishment was just beginning. The gambling debts hadn't disappeared, and the dangerous people he owed money to wouldn't be deterred by legal proceedings. What happens now? Margaret asked. Now you go home, Bradley said. You live your life. You honor Thomas's memory by being exactly who you've always been, a strong, intelligent woman who refused to let anyone make her smaller than she is. As Margaret walked down the courthouse steps, she thought about Thomas's roses, probably blooming in her garden right now. She thought about the quiet house that was truly hers again, the friends she could reconnect with now that Conrad's lies had been exposed, the freedom to grieve and heal at her own pace. The little boy she'd raised was gone, replaced by someone she could barely recognize. That loss would stay with her forever. But she'd learned something important in these past weeks. She was stronger than her grief, tougher than her loneliness, and absolutely capable of protecting herself when necessary. Thomas had known that about her even when she'd forgotten it herself. His final gift hadn't just been evidence or money. It had been the reminder that she was worth fighting for. Margaret Whitmore walked to her car, put Thomas's ring in the sunlight streaming through the windshield, and drove home to the life she'd saved. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her garden watching the morning sun catch the dew on Thomas's roses. The autumn blooms were smaller than the summer ones, but somehow more precious. Flowers that had survived the first frost and chosen to keep blooming anyway. She'd been thinking about resilience a lot lately. The doorbell chimed from inside the house, and Margaret smiled as she walked toward it. Every Tuesday at 10 o'clock, Ruth Caldwell brought coffee and stayed for an hour. It had taken weeks after the trial to rebuild their friendship, but Ruth had been one of the first neighbors to apologize once the truth about Conrad's lies came out. Margaret, dear, Ruth said, balancing a thermos and a plate of her famous oatmeal cookies. How are you feeling today? Strong, Margaret replied, and meant it. They settled in the kitchen, the same room where Conrad had threatened her just months ago. But the space felt different now, lighter, filled with laughter instead of tension. Margaret had redecorated slightly, adding cheerful yellow curtains, and moving Thomas's coffee mug to a place of honor on the windowsill, where it caught the morning light. "Any word from the district attorney's office?" Ruth asked gently. They'd covered this ground before, but she knew Margaret needed to talk about it. Conrad pleaded guilty to elder abuse and fraud charges last week. 18 months in minimum security prison, plus restitution and community service. Margaret stirred her coffee thoughtfully. His lawyer said it was the best deal they could get. Ruth shook her head sadly. "I still can't believe it. That sweet little boy who used to help me carry groceries." "People change," Margaret said simply. "Sometimes not for the better." But even as she said it, Margaret felt the truth was more complicated. Conrad hadn't changed so much as revealed who he'd always been underneath. Someone who saw relationships as transactions, love as leverage. The gambling had just brought those tendencies to the surface. The settlement of Thomas's life insurance had been completed 3 weeks ago. $2 million, more money than Margaret had ever imagined having. She'd used some of it to pay off their small mortgage and set aside funds for home maintenance and her own future care. The rest was going toward something Thomas would have loved. "I finalized the scholarship fund yesterday," Margaret told Ruth. "The Thomas Whitmore Memorial Scholarship for first-generation college students. It'll provide full tuition for 2 students every year, indefinitely." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "Margaret, Thomas would be so proud." Margaret touched the wedding ring she still wore on her left hand. Not Thomas's ring, which sat in a place of honor on her dresser, but her own wedding band that she'd never taken off. "I think he knew what I'd do with the money. He always said education was the one investment that could never be taken away from you." The first recipients had been chosen just last week. A young woman studying nursing and a man in his 30s going back to school for engineering. Margaret had met them both, seen the hope and determination in their eyes, and felt Thomas's presence as strongly as if he'd been standing beside her. After Ruth left, Margaret spent the afternoon at her volunteer work. She'd started helping at the senior center downtown, teaching other widows how to manage their finances and recognize signs of financial abuse. Word had spread about her experience with Conrad, and the center director had asked if she'd be willing to share her story with others who might be facing similar situations. It was hard work, emotionally draining, but deeply meaningful. Just last month, she'd helped an 80-year-old woman named Helen recognize that her nephew was stealing from her bank account. The intervention had saved Helen's life savings and led to the nephew's arrest. "You have a gift for this," Janet Bradley, Michael's wife and the center's director, told Margaret as they cleaned up after that day's workshop. "You make people feel safe enough to tell the truth about what's happening to them." Margaret considered this as she drove home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood. Perhaps surviving Conrad's betrayal had taught her something valuable about recognizing manipulation and finding strength in the darkest moments. If her pain could prevent others from experiencing the same isolation and fear, then maybe some good could come from it. At home, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Her heart clenched for a moment. Old habits died hard, but the return address showed it was from her sister Eleanor in Portland. Inside was a photograph. Eleanor and her husband Robert standing in front of their RV, smiling broadly at the camera. On the back, Eleanor had written, "Getting ready for our cross-country trip. First stop, Chicago to see my amazing sister. We'll be there next Tuesday. Love you." Margaret smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Eleanor had called every week since the trial, offering support and asking pointed questions about how she was really doing. Having family who truly cared felt like a luxury after months of Conrad's fake concern. The phone rang as she was preparing dinner. A simple meal for one, but made with care and eaten without the shadow of fear that had haunted her table for so long. "Mrs. Whitmore? This is Robert Klein from the jewelry store." Margaret's heart jumped slightly. "Is everything all right?" "Oh yes, perfectly fine. I'm calling because I have something here I think you'll want to see. A gentleman brought in a very unusual piece this afternoon. A man's wedding band with an inscription that caught my attention." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "The inscription reads, 'To my forever, MH June 14th, 1979. The same date as your wedding, and those are your initials, aren't they?" The gentleman who brought it in said it was his grandfather's ring, But when I told him I knew those initials and that date, he admitted he'd bought it from someone who needed quick cash months ago. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas had commissioned matching rings for their wedding, his with her initials, hers with his. She'd assumed his had been lost years ago when he'd had to have it resized. The gentleman wants to return it to the rightful owner, Robert continued. No charge. He said some things are too important to be bought and sold. 20 minutes later, Margaret stood in Robert's shop, holding Thomas's other ring. The one he'd worn every day until arthritis forced him to stop. The inscription was exactly as she remembered. To my forever, MH. He kept it, she whispered, tears blurring her vision. Even after he couldn't wear it, he kept it safe. Robert smiled gently. The gentleman who brought it in said he found it with some papers in a safety deposit box he inherited. There was a note with it, instructions to bring it to me if anything ever happened to the owner. Margaret turned the ring over in her hands, feeling the weight of promises kept and love that transcended death. Thomas had protected this ring just as he'd protected her, quietly, carefully, thinking ahead to moments she couldn't imagine. That evening, Margaret sat in Thomas's chair with both rings resting on the table beside her. Outside, her roses glowed in the sunset light, and the house settled around her with familiar, comforting sounds. She wasn't lonely anymore. Not with Eleanor coming to visit, not with her volunteer work, not with Ruth's weekly coffee visits and the small community of friends she'd rebuilt. Conrad would be released from prison in a year and a half. Margaret had been asked if she wanted to attend his parole hearings, if she wanted to maintain the restraining order, if she wanted any contact with him at all. She declined all of it. Her son had made his choices, and she'd made hers. She wished him no harm, but she also wouldn't allow him another opportunity to hurt her. The truth was, she'd learned something important in the past 6 months. Forgiveness didn't require relationship. She could forgive Conrad for being who he was while still protecting herself from who he'd become. Margaret picked up Thomas's rings and held them to the light. Tomorrow she would have them cleaned and polished, then place them in the box where she kept her most precious memories. They would be safe there, just as she was safe now in the life she'd fought to preserve. The phone rang one more time before bed. Margaret almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Is this Margaret Whitmore? A young woman's voice, nervous but determined. Yes. My name is Sarah Hendricks. I'm one of the recipients of the Thomas Whitmore Memorial Scholarship. I just wanted to call and say thank you. This scholarship, it's changing my life. I'm going to be a nurse because of you and your husband's generosity. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thomas always believed in the power of education to transform lives. I'm so glad we could help. Mrs. Whitmore, if you don't mind me asking, I heard about what you went through with your son. I'm studying geriatric nursing, and I want you to know that your story is inspiring other people to stand up for themselves. You're helping more people than you know. After the call ended, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness of her living room and felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Complete peace. Not the absence of sadness. She would always miss her husband and grieve the loss of the son she'd thought she knew. But peace with her choices, her strength, her ability to build a meaningful life even after devastating loss. She thought about that young woman, Sarah, studying to become a nurse with help from Thomas's memory. She thought about Helen and the other women at the senior center, learning to protect themselves from those who would exploit their vulnerability. She thought about Eleanor coming to visit, and Ruth bringing coffee every Tuesday, and the garden where Thomas's roses bloomed in defiant beauty. Margaret rose and walked to the window, looking out at the street where she'd lived for 28 years. Porch lights glowed warmly in the darkness, and she could see neighbors moving through their lighted windows, living their ordinary, precious lives. This was what Thomas had fought to preserve. Not just her house or her money, but her right to live with dignity, to make her own choices, to find meaning and joy even after the worst kind of betrayal. Margaret turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, Thomas's rings safe in her pocket. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new ways to honor the love that had sustained her and the strength she'd discovered in herself. For the first time in over a year, she was looking forward to tomorrow. And that's Margaret's story. A reminder that sometimes the people we trust most can become our greatest threats, but with courage, evidence, and the right allies, we can protect what matters most. Margaret chose to transform her pain into purpose, helping other elderly people recognize financial abuse while honoring Thomas's memory through education. Here's what I'm curious about. Do you think Margaret made the right choice in cutting contact with Conrad completely, or should she have tried to maintain some relationship despite everything he did? It's a question that doesn't have easy answers. The balance between protecting ourselves and holding on to hope for the people we love. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us bring you more stories of resilience, justice, and the strength we never knew we had. Your support and perspectives mean everything to our storytelling community here. Thank you.